This is
Make It Plain.
Make It Plain.
MIP.
With Masamela Matfumo.
Mark Thompson.
Make It Plain.
Get woke.
God bless you. Get woke. Folks, MIP is now COVID-free, meaning free to all subscribers as we navigate this pandemic. We're thinking about everyone, and we've got to get through this together. So for a limited time, no fee to subscribe to Make It Plain on your favorite podcast app. Folks, as you know, I spend a lot of time reading ProPublica, and I've encouraged each of you to do the same as well. There is always journalism there that you can't find anywhere else, and very important journalism. What have we all been talking about, these many months, but mail-in ballots? What is taking place with mail-in ballots today in North Carolina? Well, my guests have taken a look at that. First of all, we have Sophie Chow from ProPublica, and the co-author of this piece is actually with the television news station in Raleigh, Tyler Dukes with WRAL News. The headline: in North Carolina, Black voters' mail-in ballots much more likely to be rejected than those from any other race. So let's drill down on that with Sophie and Tyler. First of all, how are you both? Welcome to Make It Plain.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
It's a pleasure to have you. Sophie, let me start with you. How did this get your attention in the first place?
Yeah, so I mean, we're all thinking about mail-in ballots this year because of COVID. And I actually was inspired by some studies from the ACLU that showed that in Florida and more recently in Georgia, that younger and minority voters' ballots were more likely to be rejected. So I read these studies and I was surprised by them at first because I just didn't know what the numbers were before. And then I started thinking about where else I could basically do this. Where else could I also see if there was any discrimination or like bias happening in ballots being rejected. And in North Carolina, we were able to get that data. And so I just kind of started from there.
Tyler, that data was made pretty readily available, was it, by the Board of Elections?
It was. And in fact, traditionally in North Carolina, a lot of this data about absentee ballots, just about voting in general, even the normal voting rolls, are all of that very public, very accessible. It's not even a situation where you have to request it. It's just downloadable. And it's really come in handy over the past couple of years in covering elections and monitoring the flow of votes. And, especially it's come in handy in the past for us when we've done things like look into the issues in the 9th district back in 2018, which ended up, essentially overturning that initial election because of some problems with the mail-in ballot system down in the southeastern part of the state. So yeah, this is data that we work with pretty frequently. And what I liked about this is this was a different kind of question that we had never asked of that data before until ProPublica reached out to us.
We're talking about the data from the 2018 midterms, correct, Sophie?
Mm-hmm.
So is there any way, well, let me not do that yet. Let me do this. Let me put it this way. Do we have any hint as to, I know we can speculate, but do we have any hint as to why Black voters' ballots were rejected at a higher rate?
Yeah, so that's the really tricky question because, when they're tossing out ballots or not, the people doing that don't actually know the race of the voter. So it's not like, you know what race somebody is. But there is there's a big history of discrimination against Black voters in the South. And there's also a question of whether or not voters are being properly educated on how to fill out those ballots. So there's not like one simple, clean answer that we can see from the data, but it's definitely a cause for concern.
Tyler, as I'm looking at this, Black voters' ballots, 14% of those cast by mail in 2018, but also same percentage rejection rate, 14%, correct?
The rejection rate was, something around 14%, exactly right. And, one of the things that is interesting in looking at this data, and this has been changing over the years, but by mail voting, absentee by mail voting in North Carolina has traditionally been the domain of older white voters. And so, one of the things we did in the process of reporting out this story is, talk to political scientists and also voting rights advocates in North Carolina. Basically, one of the prevailing theories is that Black voters in the recent years have been new to the voting by mail process, and new voters in a certain process or maybe more likely to make certain errors. And so that's one sort of theory here. But that is very much rooted, as Sophie noted, in this overt discriminatory actions in North Carolina and other southern states. And as one of the people we talked to, Irving Joyner, who's a civil rights advocate in North Carolina, pointed out, a lot of times historically Black voters have wanted to show up to the polls and literally see that form going into the tabulator. And so because we see Black voters turning out by mail at a smaller percentage, that may be one contributor to this. But, this is really important in 2020 because we're seeing this astronomical rise in the number of people who are already voting by mail. We're already 10 to 15% ahead of, in 2016. But, if we talk about a lot of rejections, that might not be a huge deal in a year where the percentage of voting by mail is very small. But in 2020, where this is way larger, this has even more important implications beyond, the people who, quite frankly, in 2018 were rejected, some of them not even knowing that their votes weren't counted.
Sophie, we do have, I can tell from the article, a glimpse of what 2020 is looking like as well already, don't we? Tell us about that, if you would.
Right. So it's not looking great in 2020, and we're seeing a similar pattern. So at the time that we wrote this, the rejection rate for mail-in ballots submitted by Black voters was nearly 3 times as high as the rejection rate for white voters. And, election officials do say we still have time to fix those errors. Voters are supposed to get notified when they make a mistake. But from working on the story, we see that a lot of voters, they just never know that their ballot has mistakes and they don't get the chance to fix that.
Is that because there actually isn't follow-up to fix the mistake? Or is there some other reason that they're not aware that a mistake has been made?
I think reaching out to all the voters is a hard job. Like even in writing the story, it's not easy to, county officials have to reach out to these voters and let them know. But, maybe they're not getting the right number, maybe they're not getting the right address, or there's simply not enough time to contact them all. And especially this year when so many people are voting by mail, the system gets really overwhelmed.
Tyler, do we have a sense of what the mistakes are on African-American ballots?
We do. And essentially what we have in the data is these categories, these broad categories. And what Sophie and I spent a lot of time doing is trying to figure out, what do those categories really mean? And when you think about how you fill out one of these ballots, you have to have basically a set of things checked off. You have to make sure you sign. You had to, in 2018, have 2 witnesses. Those 2 witnesses also had to sign, also had to put their names and addresses and things of that nature on that ballot. And so all of those things have to be in place in order for a vote to be counted by law. So we saw one of the most common problems was someone forgetting to put the voter signature on that absentee ballot envelope or putting it in the wrong place. We also saw cases where the witness information was missing, and that might have meant that not enough witnesses had signed, or maybe they didn't sign or didn't put their address. And these are all things that boards of elections don't really have, or at least in 2018, didn't really have a lot of wiggle room for allowing those mistakes. We are seeing something a little bit different this year. So we have seen, because of lawsuits over the absentee by mail process, namely driven by the coronavirus, the requirements are a little bit different. So earlier this year, the legislature passed a law to reduce that witness requirement from 2 to 1. So we should see that come down just a little bit. The absentee ballot envelopes were redesigned this year to make them a little bit easier to read. And one of the things that's in flux right now is what's called the cure process. So this is the process by which these county boards are allowing people to fix those ballots. And that could mean sending them a new one, or in some cases, they're actually sending them voters an affidavit that just says, I was the one that filled this out. I put the signature in the wrong place, but it is my ballot, sending that back so that they don't have to go through the entire process again. So, as Sophie mentioned, there is still time to fix some of these rejections. But, we're really going to be watching this closely, I think, over the next couple of weeks to see if those techniques are working. And, frankly, how some of those techniques are even going to work out in practice over the next couple of weeks.
It's scary. I'm just reading you all's account of one subject you interviewed, Bowman Dorsey, who can't imagine. They said her husband's ballot was not in the envelope. And she can't imagine how that could have happened, And it seems kind of far-fetched to me if they're both mailing them together. And then she didn't find out, as others didn't find out, that there was this problem until this came up as a story. Right, Sophie?
Yeah. So actually, they said that her ballot wasn't in the envelope.
Her ballot, I'm sorry. Okay.
No. Yeah, but she didn't know until Tyler reached out to her. And I think that's one of the really tricky things. I feel, it seems, could she have sent a envelope back with no ballot? Maybe, but I think the hard thing is that she wasn't contacted. She didn't know about it. And then in the end, she didn't get to vote. And that's like 2 people in the same household. So I think that the hard part about all of this is that there's so many ways that mailing your ballot could go wrong. And it's so important that people know how to fill it correctly and that they're alerted when something's wrong about it.
You mentioned the curing process. So that is up and running. But I guess, Tyler, what you're saying, it's probably a little early to tell about its effectiveness, huh? And I wonder, can you even determine the effectiveness while an election process is ongoing, for that matter?
We can certainly watch it. I mean, if what we have seen so far is in any indication, something like 300,000 people have already cast their ballots successfully in North Carolina. So, we're running far ahead of 2016. But, in this data, and Sophie and I kind of looked at this, especially over the last couple of days before we actually published the story, the numbers right now, they change a lot. And one of the things we see in the data is these new categories where they're pending, or they're awaiting a cure, or they've been accepted after a cure has been put in place. For example, that affidavit comes through and the board accepts that ballot. So we are seeing some of these ballots be accepted through this process. We can kind of see that in the data. We can see it reflected in the aggregate. I think one of the good signs here is that we're all talking about this. We're all talking about this not in the days before the election, but a month or more before. And I think, I think as a political press, one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure we're educating voters, and voters are hearing about this and are familiar with this. But we're also seeing the state board, try to take these steps and try to help people fill this out. There's also a lot of other new tools this year, including an electronic system that will actually send you an alert when your ballot has been received and counted. So, they are trying to put some things in place to mitigate some of these rejections. And hopefully it will work out. But, we will see this start to, escalate over the next month or so. And, but it will be interesting to see once things are all said and done after the election, whether these processes worked.
Sophie, how does North Carolina compare with other states?
In terms of like looking at race and stuff, so the hard part about all this election, like voting is a very local process. So in every state, people release different kind of data and different numbers. So it's a little bit hard to like just compare, because in some states, you can't get that information. But, if we look in the past and we look at the midterms in 2018 and other work that has been done, we kind of see the same pattern, the same high rejection rates for minority voters happen also in Florida and also in Georgia. And there's just a lot this year that's special, and that makes it difficult. And North Carolina is not unique to that. So like in Brooklyn, where I live, just a few days ago, everybody's absentee ballot had a thousand or so had the wrong name and address on them. So, we see lots of issues coming up everywhere. It's just hard to really accurately measure that all.
Yeah. And it's scary, as you all allude to in the piece. I know for a lot of African Americans, Tyler, the choice will still be, even in COVID, unfortunately, to go and vote in person because people are fearful. Then you have that peculiar individual in the White House we all saw on the debate the other night, talking crazy about mail-in balloting anyway. And it's obvious people feel he's trying to thwart it with all we've seen with the post office. So, and I know you talked to some people, but in general, as you were reporting on this story, Tyler, did you find African Americans who were saying, look, we feel safer, even in COVID, to just go down and vote in person?
Absolutely. Yeah. We talked to, I think, more than a dozen voters who, either were rejected, one or more times or didn't end up getting their ballot counted. Not all of those people made it into the story. But, we had, I think, among the people we talked to, certainly talked to people who said, you know what, I'm going to show up. I'm healthy enough. I feel confident in the steps that my local election board is taking to keep me safe. So I'm going to show up either early or in person and get this done. But I will say, we also talked to a lot of people, and including the people who didn't know that their vote wasn't counted until we called them. And they said, you know what, I'm still going to vote by mail. I'm just going to make sure I'm really careful this year. I'm going to make sure that I'm tracking it. I'm going to make sure I'm going to have somebody, when they're looking at my witness stuff, that they're checking for the things they need to be checking for. And, a couple of people that we talked to, in fact, sent their ballots off in the process of our reporting. And so we're actually able to report back to them, your ballot has been accepted. And so I think one of the things that I took away from this is, even though this does worry people, it certainly disappointed these people, many of whom had never missed a vote, in decades, basically, of voting. There was no one here who was deterred. There was no one here who was so disappointed in the process that they were not going to show up again. And I think that's one thing that really we should, think about and hold on to, is that, voting sometimes is maybe a little more complicated than we think it is. But I do think that, voters are very committed, especially this year, to, making their voice heard. And I heard that from almost, in fact, every single voter that I talked to over the course of the story.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's especially true, we all know, for African Americans. I mean, when you spend over a century trying to suppress the Black vote, I think that obviously makes it more precious for those of us who understand the importance of exercising it. So we kind of alluded to it, but just for the record, Sophie, obviously you all are going to stay on this story. What's next for you all in the reporting process as you all continue to look at this?
Well, at ProPublica, actually, we're looking at voting problems everywhere, basically. So North Carolina, obviously keeping an eye on that. And this year, because people are so worried about their vote, there is data being released all the time about the people who are able to vote or not. So keeping an eye on that. But I'm also working with reporters in Florida at the Tampa Bay Times, looking at voting there and issues there, looking at voting issues with polling places in Georgia. So there's a lot to keep track of, but hopefully we'll be able to find some of these problems early enough that people can have an opportunity to vote and make their vote count.
Yeah. Before we go to Tyler, is there any advice that you might give North Carolinians or others for that matter listening, how to feel more secure about their mail-in ballot, how to make sure? I like what you said about the notification. Sophie, I don't think we even have that in New York, where you get the notification. So I'm like, we need that here. Yeah. But any advice you would give to those to say, well, how do I ensure that once I put this in an envelope and mail it, it's the way it ought to be?
Yeah, well, or Tyler, do you want to talk about the tracking?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, the guidance that we have been certainly getting from local election officials, and as Sophie noted, so much about elections is local, and these are your neighbors who are running these processes in a lot of cases. But I think, the advice that we've been getting is, do not wait. Create a voting plan for yourself. If you feel comfortable voting early or voting in person, make sure you know where your precinct is, make sure you know what your plan is for voting. And if you do choose to vote by mail, go ahead and get it in early, because that gives you some time, even if you're careful, to sort of watch that process and make sure that ballot is going through and getting counted appropriately. North Carolina, obviously, we as the media organization have been putting out a lot of resources about guiding people through this, but, the state and local boards have also been doing that, the FAQs and the, frequently asked questions and things like that. Ballot Tracks, I think, is a pretty interesting service this year, this electronic monitoring system where you sign up and it will, send you text alerts when those ballots are received. That's a pretty nice thing, to be honest. We've never had that before. And I think that's a really good tool to help you keep track of it. I think it's a lot easier when you are used to going to the polls and you're, again, used to sliding that, form right through the tabulator like a lot of us are. When we're doing it by mail, sometimes it can feel like we're on our own. We're sitting at a kitchen table and all we've got is the form in there. It can be kind of daunting. But, follow those directions. Don't be afraid to ask for help or to seek out some external resources. Do it early and, keep checking it. Make sure your vote is counted.
Sophie, you were going to say something too, I think?
I think Tyler covered all of that. But yeah, always the earlier the better. That's what we saw from our reporting. People are supposed to be notified and have an opportunity to fix their ballot, but especially with how many people are going to vote this year, you want to give as much time as possible.
Yeah, well, we are definitely in for one of the most historic elections ever when it comes to mail-in balloting. And we also know how much of a political issue it has become. So folks, check out the piece at ProPublica and on these mail-in ballots in North Carolina. Black voters' mail-in ballots much more likely to be rejected than those from another race. I do have to ask this one more question though. Do you all, you mentioned, Sophie, that you can't necessarily tell from a ballot what the race of the voter is, correct? Mm-hmm. But can't you kind of tell probably from the address? Would that not be revealing? I'm just curious.
So when you looked within the same county, Black voters' ballots were more likely to be rejected from white voters. So possibly if you're working there, you could, but I think what we're seeing is that like even in the same places, that was happening.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Sophie Chow, Tyler Duke's with us. Great piece at ProPublica. I know you all are going to stay on top of this. Keep us informed, if you don't mind. And thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Thank you both.
God, you are our refuge. Send our ancestors to guard our doors. Cast out this virus from our communities and our bodies. Heal, bless, and protect everyone listening and their loved ones. Thank you for listening to Make It Plain and Get Woke. Remember to listen, like, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. If all minds are clear, it has been made plain.